Jonathan Miller is the arts prodigy who can do everything. But on TV, every series he did about science hinted that for him the real adventure lay not in the expression of his own talent, but in the workings of the brain itself. What do we know about how the brain works? Jonathan, 40 years ago when I was making a very unconvincing attempt to study psychology, sort of hard-nosed practical psychology at Sydney University, it was fairly evident to me that nobody really knew a lot about how the brain worked, but now we know more.
Yes, we know much more, but still not nearly all there is to know. I mean, I always say that the brain is the most complicated thing in the universe. So complicated, in fact, that by contrast, the universe itself is not much more complicated than a cuckoo clock. It's so elaborate, its capabilities are so much greater than anything else on the Earth or anywhere conceivable, that it's very hard to account for the way in which it does what it does. And it's so elaborate in its format, its structure is almost beyond our understanding at the moment. But nevertheless, we do know a great deal more than we used to. After all, it's only, it's about 115 years since we understood that there were things called neurons. No one actually recognized that there were these units which transmitted impulses from one to another, and that they were separated by gaps which could be leapt across by what turned out to be a chemical transmitter, and that the traffic was mostly conducted in electrochemical terms. Well, we really got the basis of the fundamental events that the traffic was composed of right about 1930.
How was that found out when the neuron was detected? Was that microscopy?
Well, it was microscopy.
Yeah.
In fact, Freud is always claimed by the analysts to have been one of the founders of the neuron theory, but around about the end of the 19th century, microscopy had become sufficiently refined, and the resolution of microscopes was enough to see that these things were in fact cells, and that they had cell bodies and long processes which acted as cables.
So it was an electrical device?
Well, it turned out to be an electrical device. It was suspected already in the middle of the 19th century that electricity was involved. But the nature of the nerve impulse didn't become apparent until we had electronic devices which could record from individual nerve cells. And that was really done in the late 20s and early 30s, and they discovered that the nerve impulse was what we call an all-or-none event. It either switched on and acted to the full extent of its power, or it didn't act at all.
So it's a switch, like a computer works on it. It's either
well,
on or
the
off.
switch is is at the junction between adjacent neurons, but the actual traffic, what is conducted, is simply an electrical pulse which is mediated by some sort of chemical transport in the membrane.
I'm like every amateur klutz who ever gets near the subject. I immediately start looking for analogies between the brain and the computer. That's why I say
people searched for analogies. The first analogy that was used was the first model or metaphor was the telephone exchange, because it was apparent that from the versatility of behavior that there had to be some sort of device which could switch from one circuit to another, and the most obvious one was the telephone exchange, where you could take a thing out of a socket and put it into another socket and reconnect one caller to another. Well, it became more and more apparent that it was much more complicated than that. The computational metaphor didn't start to really surface in any significant way until the 50s, although computational theory was developing in the late 30s. And of course, the important development was purely theoretical and mathematical. It was
that
long
Turing's paper?
Well, Turing's paper was...
What did that paper say? If you could do this and that with the machine, then it would actually behave like a brain.
No, I don't think that was what Turing was interested in. Von Neumann and Turing were interested in the logic of a machine which could convey information and could express information in a coded form and could perform regular and predictable calculations. At that time, that wasn't the name of the game was not trying to prove how brains worked, but trying to work out the logic of some sort of machine which could compute and could behave in a regular and predictable fashion when given what we call instructions or a program. Now, as the success of that idea of computation developed under the influence of not only Turing but von Neumann, it became more and more attractive to think that this might be the way in which the brain acted, that the brain computed in some way.
Could you say the brain had a basic capacity, say at the instinctual level, and then it's got all that capacity, and then it develops more capacity as it takes things in?
Well, I wouldn't. I don't think that the instinctual is basic. This fundamental computational process is probably even more basic, or it may well be that instinct itself is implemented in a computational fashion. I mean, what one wants to be quite clear about is what sort of discourse one is using. Is one talking about nervous activity, or is one talking about psychological activity? Now, the problem is how you map psychological activity onto purely physical activity inside a set of circuits.
Yeah, well, when you go through the history of the human being since day one, which we usually call the primeval forest, although it may have been before that, there's obviously a survival instinct at the start. It takes a long, long time before that gets to ethics.
Yes, but long before there are survival instincts, there are all sorts of fairly simple, robotically reproducible capabilities that all bodies have by virtue of the fact that they move around. Whether they're moving under the influence of instincts and desires is in a sense beside the point. What you have to explain first of all is how it is that things can remain upright and move around in response to changes in the environment. How are the changes in the environment registered by sense organs?
That's quite complicated in itself, isn't it?
It's extremely complicated.
If I walk to the door and then look through the door to see if anyone's coming and so on, the actions involved are very, very hard to reproduce with a machine.
Well, those activities are fairly easy to reproduce with machines now. We can produce robots which can find their way around a room and avoid obstacles and
fight each other.
And well, they can do fairly simple things like getting through doors. Now, they don't represent it to themselves as doors. They represent it to themselves as being an aperture which will not obstruct their onward movement. We call that a door, and there are all sorts of elaborate connotations which we have by virtue of the concept of doors, which robots don't necessarily have. Robots can simply behave as if what we call doors were openings which allow them to get through without bumping.
We could have been much simpler. Another way of putting it is, who needs it? Why do human beings have to be that much more complicated than a cockroach?
Well, they haven't got to be. What happens, of course, is that they became more complicated because in becoming more complicated, they outcompeted other species. And natural selection is extremely efficient, and when something is more efficient at, say, foreseeing the future and calculating and having foresight, it will do better and outcompete other creatures which are less efficiently endowed computationally. But there's no need for it. There's no need for life at all. Once it's up and running, and variations occur in an unsolicited way, which is what we mean by a mutation. There are constant typing mistakes in the transcriptions from one generation to another. Now, most of those mistakes in transcription are disastrous, and the creature doesn't even get delivered. It's not even born. But just occasionally, a microscopic advantage is conferred upon the creature by virtue of the mutation which occurs, and it simply has a more a favourable chance than anything else around.
I think anyone who notices things about the way brains behave has a right to speak. He just mustn't call himself a scientist. You are and I'm not, but there's something I noticed when I was quite young. I was at a show in Sydney. It was a hypnotism show. A guy called the Great Franklin. Mm-hmm. And the Great Franklin shtick was to call people out of the audience at random, he said, and I think he did. He put them under, and he got them to do things, and they did things that revealed an extraordinary mental capacity, which I know that in ordinary life they didn't have. Like he persuaded a young man I know to be a German officer, and the guy was strutting around the stage and speaking German, and it seemed to me that he was using stuff that he'd seen or heard during his life, and that the storage capacity of the brain might be much, much bigger than I'd estimated it to be.
Well, it certainly is, or it's larger than we know in any individual, and it's because it's larger than we consciously know that we can do what we consciously perform.
Do we keep everything?
Well, that's extremely hard. What we do is to keep a very large amount without having to think about it. It would be extremely expensive to devise a machine which remained conscious of everything that it experienced. It's much more economic to have a machine where there's a limited workspace, which we call consciousness, which deals with events in the here and now, and then has a vast area of computational competence, which in fact you never have to think about. It delivers its results, its conclusions into consciousness if and when they're needed for conscious consideration and for more subtle and more versatile forms of judgment.
Or even subconscious processing, like dreaming. Suppose tonight I dreamed, and and a bit of this conversation was in it. Would that imply that the whole conversation had gone into storage, or would it just be using a fragment?
Well, it might well be that a very large amount of it is stored in some way. I mean, we know from certain experiments that the capacity to retrieve experiences is much larger than we realize by choosing to retrieve. You see, for example, there was an interesting experiment done some years ago where a set of students were shown something like 5 or even 10,000 photographs at 5-second intervals without any instruction to memorize them. They were just asked to look at them, concentrate on them for a moment, and look carefully. And that was all. And over the course of a day, something like 10,000 of these snapshots were shown on a carousel. And a week later, 5,000 photographs were shown to them with 5,000 that they'd not seen before, and they simply had to press a button when it was one that they recognized. And they were 95% right.
Hell's bells.
Now, that's called recognition memory as opposed to retrieval memory. If you'd asked them to recall and give an account of the photographs that they have seen, they wouldn't have succeeded in doing that.
That's how the cops from the car do spot the criminal.
Well, yes, it's certainly an important part of recognition, but it happens to us all. You know quite well that when you arrive in a foreign city and you unpack your bags and then you decide to go for a little walk before coming back to the hotel for supper, and you go for about half a mile, and then you say, well, Christ, I don't know how to get back to the hotel. And then you turn around and you suddenly remember, oh yes, there was that pharmacist on the corner. You go to the pharmacist on the corner, which you remember passing, and you then look around and say, oh yes, I remember there was that funny inscription, a piece of graffiti on that poster, and so on and so forth. Now, if you had been asked to list the things which were to be seen on that journey that you had made, you would probably be, well, almost certainly be incapable of doing it. But it's as if a series of Polaroids had been taken one after another in the course of the journey, stored somewhere, and they were recognized, but they couldn't be consciously and deliberately retrieved.
We don't have to posit a concept of the characteristics of, say, a woman's face or a man's face. As long as the brain has seen enough women and known they're women, and enough men know they're men, You don't have to say there's a mechanism in the brain that recognizes a certain shape of eye or softness of lip. I did see somewhere that someone was trying to do neural net programming with a machine, and this is the way you got it to distinguish between men and women. You didn't try to program into it characteristics that it would spot. You just had to tell it often enough that that was a man and that was a woman, so that it got the experience.
Yes, and then it sees, or it computes what seems to be in common to one class rather than another. Now, we don't quite know how it does this, although neural network theory is... I'm not a good enough mathematician to understand exactly how connectionism, as it's called, works. But it seems to be very efficient. You can teach a machine to recognize different forms of alphabetical characters, even in different typefaces. Now, that's rather remarkable. But it's no more remarkable than what we do, which is to be able to recognize the same sentence written in 15 different handwritings, each of which are very different from one another. Nevertheless, there must be something which can compute something that particular representation of A has in the handwriting of X, and so on and so forth. And now they have produced machines which can do that. But it's an extremely complicated, mathematically complicated process which enables us to do that.
Where are the limits of reproducing things that human beings can do in machines? It's not all that long ago that I was told that a machine would never beat a grandmaster in chess, and that turned out to be wrong. And I assume from that is because chess is a relatively mechanical activity, whereas writing a poem isn't.
Well, it's a mechanical activity. It's not mechanical, but it has extremely discrete all-or-none distinctions between the pieces which are involved, although the pieces themselves may be represented by different designs. But nevertheless, there are only that number of pieces which are sharply all-or-none different from one another. A pawn that is absolutely different from a knight and a bishop. There are no things which you, as it were, playing a game of chess, find yourself wondering, well, is that a pawn or is that a knight? Well, I'll treat it as if it was neither one thing nor the other. You wouldn't be playing chess if you actually began to move things around and endowed this dubious piece with the capabilities of both pawn and knight and said, well, I'm going to allow it to move one pace forward, and I think I'll also give it the power to move one to the front and one to the side, as a knight does.
So the machine's not vague about the rules.
No, the machine's not vague about the rules because the rules themselves are absolutely definitive. So also are the moves of which the pieces are capable and the positions on the board. There's no such thing as being halfway between one square and another. It's either on the square or it's not on the square. Now, you may be a careless mover of the piece, but that's not because you're a bad chess player, it's because you're a careless mover of pieces. And someone might want to say to you, have you decided which square it's on? And no one is going to take as an excuse from you, well, I can't quite make up my mind. I'm going to put it halfway between one square and the other. You'll have to say, are you going to fuck around or play chess?
Have I got fabulous capacities in my brain which I would be able to use and stun the world with if I was less of a savant and more of an idiot? In other words, put it this way, there is always someone somewhere, usually in India, strangely enough, who is autistic and can also give you a stream of prime numbers.
Yes, well, that's not a surprise. We call them idiot-savants.
Is it the absence of an inhibition or the presence of a capacity, in other words? Have we all got the capacity, but something inhibits it? Or is it...
Well, the two are obviously related to one another, but I don't think that one inhibits the other. It's just that idiot-savants are creatures that are unable to do most of the things which we find important and interesting, and are capable of doing exorbitantly remarkable things with processes which we find relatively boring. I mean, no one particularly wants in real life to discover the square root of...
And you can't stop them, yeah.
You can't stop them.
Would it be too much to say that we could probably all do that, but we're socialised out of it at an early age?
No, we can't do that. I mean, it seems to be part of the defect. rather than something which we all could do if we set our minds to it, or if we were more relaxed, or if we could take our minds off all sorts of things which otherwise prevent us from doing it. It's part of the deficiency. Yeah. It's rather like, for example, the sometimes, though not frequent, peculiar capabilities that autistic children have for doing drawings which are extremely sophisticated vis-à-vis the representation of perspective.
Whole cities.
Whole cities, of course, that's that famous young man who could do that. But there was a young girl called Nadia who, when asked to draw rocking horses, drew them as if from the viewpoint which only an adult artist would be able to do, whereas a child, when asked to draw her rocking horse, would in fact draw it from what was the canonical position from which to see rocking horses, or from which to represent what she regarded as the essential defining characteristics of a rocking horse, and therefore would probably draw it from the side, and might, if, for example, she was drawing it, might even have the legs sticking out unrealistically on each side, so that you could quite clearly see that it had 4 legs. In other words, she was representing pictorially, and a normal child does, she represents pictorially an inventory of what she knows the creature has, which is 4 legs. You find it when children draw tables, for example. Even if you ask them to draw a table from a particular viewpoint, they will not, unless they're autistic, draw one leg obscuring the other. They will often draw a square and then have 4 legs sticking out at the side in a way that no table can have if it's going to be useful as a table, because what she has done is to reproduce pictorially the verbal instructions she has had about what tables consist of.
But the kid who was drawing the cities had this extraordinary... did it come from his ability to notice? I mean, he'd seen perspective in the world.
Well, he hadn't seen perspective in the world. What he'd seen vistas,
yes.
And what he seemed to be able to do was to reproduce the vista as seen from that particular position, and that's something which was only painfully acquired over many, many years with the discovery of single-point perspective at the time of Alberti and Brunelleschi.
How do you study a person? How is the research working? When I came into psychology and rapidly went out 40 years ago, the science was still existing on the stock of people who'd been damaged in war, for example. So certain parts of the brain were missing, or there were lesions, and by deduction you could say, well, that must take care of that, and so on. And that was as far as it went. What's the physical business of the study now? How does it work?
Well, I mean, I think that there are all sorts of fundamental changes which took place around about the time when you quit the subject. It was the beginning of what was called the cognitive revolution. And what you have to remember that between about 1924 and about 1954, there was this long drought in the study of psychology due to the influence of this dogma called behaviorism.
Yes.
Now, behaviorism, which was the phrase was first coined by the American psychologist Watson, John B. Watson, and it developed in the belief that in order to do science on the mind, in order to make it as respectable as chemistry and as respectable as physics, it had to deal with publicly noticeable, publicly observable events. Now, the only events with which we are directly acquainted, vis-à-vis the mind of others, or indeed our own mind, but certainly the mind of others, is what's going into the head and what's coming out in the form of behavior. So that what people studied was the input, the stimulus, a light going on, and then the action of the creature, which had either had or hadn't learned to press a lever when a light came on. Well, that meant that there was this vast black box between the input and the output, between the input and the behavior, about which Watson and his colleagues did not care to speculate. Something goes on in there which implements it. Well, with the cognitive revolution, the mind came back into the study, as George Miller, one of the great psychologists of the 1950s, the mind came back on on the back of the machine, and it came back, made now respectable by computational theory, that there must be internal representations which the machine does operations upon, and that what is going on in the brain must be some sort of computational process on internal representations or models of the world, which then get consistently and continuously updated.
Jonathan, I was determined to talk about the connection of art and science because they're connected in you. And really, we run out of time, but you're not really in the business of one-word answers. But are they connected, apart from in a person?
I don't think they're very significantly or importantly connected, no, because I think that the business of science is finding out how the world is. And it's things are either true or they're untrue. And that's not what art is about. Art is about amusing ourselves and making interesting conjectures about what we feel about it, about things that please us in shapes and so forth. Now, the shapes that please us are not true of the world. We don't judge pictures by the extent to which they accurately represent the way things are. We don't use them in the way that we use maps or photographs in order to check someone at the passport office. We don't, for example, employ a tician in the post office when we want to get our picture for going through.
Although it might take that long.
Through immigration, but it's a different enterprise altogether. And
Jonathan, I think we should save this for another program. Would you come back,
yes,
please?
Of course.
Jonathan Miller.